What's up, guys? Our project this quarter is going to be a snowfall simulation. We're going to have a bunch of snowflakes being moved by gravity and wind, and they're going to appear to have depth with a certain parallax effect. Maybe we can add sliders for the user to control these things along the way, and maybe we'll have time to add other stuff like a roof, and the snow will stack up and slide nicely. Maybe it can accumulate at the bottom into little hills. We'll see where the mood takes us. But I'm giving you, to start with, this tiny little template that has one snowflake straight down forever. Let's see if we can get a test run. So I've got a single white circle, and it goes down, not constantly, but it goes down, accelerating due to gravity. And it's actually continuing to go down now, even though it's off screen. The velocity is getting bigger and bigger, and the y coordinate is getting lower and lower because nothing ever stops that. So your first assignment, and this video is recapping the first three, your first assignment was to recycle it. When it hits the bottom, we have a choice. We can delete that snowflake, we can destroy that object and create a new one, but I think it's going to be a lot better to just move it, to just say, hey, that memory is already there, we don't need to create a whole new spot in memory. We can just change one or two things to appear as if it's really a new snowflake when it's the same one that's gone off screen. So I could start off by saying, well, maybe as part of the update, I can go if self.y is greater than height, and remember, greater than means it's gone down enough because the coordinates start in the top left. I could say self.y equals 0, and this would move it back up to the top when it hits the bottom. But you're going to see there's a problem with that. It doesn't slow down. It in fact gets faster and faster, and after just a few we can barely see it because the acceleration is piling up on the velocity, and we need to reset that as well. We need to imagine that it just popped into existence at the top, and then it starts moving due to gravity, but it never had a boost at the beginning when it's created in the clouds or whatever. It's not like shot downwards, it's just pulled downwards. So I could do some of this stuff again like we did in the initialization, but I don't feel like typing it again, making a much longer class, and most of all, I really don't want to get stuck with the responsibility of changing them both in the future. If I decide to add some new property when it starts, I have to make sure I add it here and also here, and I would forget, and it would be a whole mess. So instead, I'm going to do what we saw in one of the Code Wars exercises we did recently and what we saw in a video, which is to make a reset method. A lot of times an object will just need to be reset. So let's make that, and then we can call it from in here, and we can also call it from here. We can also call it from some other place later if we have a button for the user to just reset everything, and maybe that will go not only for this object but some other ones too. So I'm going to say probably the gravity is going to be constant forever. I don't really need to reset that, and maybe the radius too. I think in the future we'll make the radii different for different snowflakes because they'll have a parallax look where the closer ones are big and the smaller ones are far. I think I might keep that there for now and just take all this stuff into the reset. But you never know. It's easy enough to move things in and out, and it will only be one thing at a time. If I move this line in here, then I don't have to figure out all the other places where it shows up or anything like that. So let's hit run and see what happens. I've got a single snowflake, and it hits the bottom. I want it to start over as if it had been dropped into existence at the top of the screen, and not getting faster. Okay, that's great. It looks good. I know it looks a little bit choppy, as if the frame rate is having hiccups, but for some reason it gets better when we have more. I think the way that Pygame refreshes the window here, it's actually going to look fine when we have a bunch. And that is assignment number 2. Assignment number 2 was to make a bunch of snowflakes, and I just said 100 just as a number that is arbitrary, but eventually we'll have more. I think I've tried 300 and 400 and they're totally fine. So let's imagine we're going to make 100 right at the beginning. And if I do that, it works, but you can't see it because they're all stacked on top of each other. That little dot is really 100 in the same coordinates. So let's add this with a random x. Okay, we'll say range width, because that means from 0 to the width, so anywhere on the available visible area could be the spot for this snowflake. And now we're going to have 100 that are randomly distributed. If I ran it again, or even when they hit the top because they reset, they are slightly different, but it's hard to tell because it's just a mess, right? Now sometimes this happens in nature. If you see like a tree branch shake and then a bunch of snow falls all at once, or a gutter warms up just enough to release a whole row of ice. But of course we want them to be staggered horizontally as well as vertically. So that's the third assignment, is to make them look like snow, where some is above and some is below. And I would say there are 2 ways to do that. One is to stagger them in space and to just shift them up and down. And another one is to stagger them in time and to have one a little bit later, one a little bit later, one. And I think we'll probably end up doing both. But let's start with this little guy. Since we already did random x, why not try random y and see how that looks? What I'm going to do is to have them appear above the visible window. They're going to appear off screen, and so they'll fall into the screen, some of them having started a little higher, some of them having started a little lower, and we'll see what that gives us. Now they're not going to be spread out enough, so it's going to be this little band of nicely random snowflakes, but then a bunch of nothing, and then another band. And you can see they are kind of stretching out a little bit each time, because now they have 2 ways of being apart, which is where they start and when they hit the bottom is kind of like slowly diverging. But what I would also like to do, because I think this is going to look good, is to slowly drip feed a little bit at a time. If I hit run in my final version, once it's all beautiful, I don't really want it to appear as a blizzard at first. I'd like to have doot, 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 and it kind of, well, I was going to say snowballs, because that's a word we use for things building up from small beginnings. So let's imagine that instead of this, and maybe we'll still use something like that in the future, but imagine that we're going to have them appear a little bit at a time. I've already got a counter variable, which is just 1 every frame. Maybe there's a built-in way to get the frames, but I just made a little integer. And I'm going to say, what if we get 1 every 10 frames? That's pretty fast because we have 60 frames a second. So we'll already get 6 in the first second. It's not like you have to wait all day, especially when we're testing it. We don't want to do something really slow. But let's imagine if counter modulo 10, and I do the not, but you could also do equals 0. It just, for some reason, not looks cuter to me. And you can say snowflakes dot append snowflake, and we don't need to give it any numbers to start with because that all happens inside the initialization or the reset. Maybe we'll change that, but we'll see how it goes. So we're going to get 1 right away and then 1 every 10 frames. Let's see how that goes. They're still appearing above the screen sometimes, so we won't have that weird thing where it just pops into existence, like an open world game where you get close to the trees and then you just see them appear. That looks great. I do want it a little slower at first. You know, maybe I'll have it show like every 30 frames or something, but that's pretty good. The bigger problem, and the thing I definitely want to address, is they keep adding. So if I waited long enough, there would be 1,000 or 2,000 or 10,000, and that could be a problem because the screen is entirely white and we can't see anything, or it could be a problem because there's too much for our calculations every frame. If it turns out that we have to calculate all this acceleration and movement for a couple hundred, that's fine, but if it's a huge amount, then we'll run into slowdown. So let's say I'm going to make a max, and I'm just going to pick 300, but it's definitely not a magic number. We could pick anything else. And len of snowflakes is less, and I'm going to make a all caps constant. This is something we'll declare at the top because if I see that down at the bottom in the loop and I think 300, where does that come from? What does that mean? Then it's a bit unexplained. But if I see max flakes, then I go, okay, we have decided upon a maximum amount of flakes. And if I want to look at what that is, I can see it at the top where we declare all our other important stuff, like the gravity, like the colors, like the size of the window. And this is equally important, maybe even more. So it's all caps, meaning it doesn't change, and it's up at the top, meaning somebody might configure this with those numbers. In the long run, if we made a huge thing, we could have a separate file called config.py or config.something else holding these types of values. So if I hit run now, then at first it's going to be the same, but it will eventually hit a limit where we won't go too high on the amount of flakes, which should mean that we can let it run forever, right? I could let this run for 10 minutes, I could let this run for 10 hours, and it would be stable. It's not going to have any kind of memory leak where it takes up more and more space each time. Once it hits 300, it should be stable. Now maybe there's something going on that I don't know about. Maybe Pygame doesn't work that long, or maybe I have a problem in my code. But the idea is that we would want this to be able to run for a while. So I think that looks good. It doesn't quite look like snow yet. And what we're going to add in the next few steps is going to improve it. We'll have some wind where it moves side to side. We'll have some parallax where things that are, instead of appearing to be 2D, they'll appear to be some of them farther out, which changes their size, it changes how they move, and then it will look more like we're sort of peering upon a distant field, which is all snow instead of just a pane of glass or a plane of geometry right in front of us. So that's your first 3 steps. 1, recycle them when they hit the bottom. 2, make at least 100. And 3, have some stagger in X and Y dimensions. You don't have to do exactly the code I did, but I'm trying to nudge toward things that are going to be helpful later. So keep it in mind. Thanks.